There was a recent announcement from a Protestant apologist, so-called, on YouTube by the name of Cleave to Antiquity, who recently announced that he was converting to Eastern Orthodoxy. Now, to be honest, I'm not that familiar with Cleave to Antiquity. I know that he had asked me to, at some point, do a discussion with him, and I hadn't yet had the chance to do that. But I've watched a couple little things that he had done, and then he announced again that he was converted to Eastern Orthodoxy. Now, he's a name I haven't really heard until, I don't know, maybe 6 months ago, and it seems like he had started to grow a platform a bit on YouTube. And I assume that he's been looking into Eastern Orthodoxy for at least that long, or at least if he's responsible in any way, he would have spent at least that long studying something like this before jumping into another tradition like that. But this situation, I think, brings up some really significant problems with the whole theological sphere on YouTube. And these are problems that I have noted plenty of times in the past. And so I want to talk about a couple things that I see as significant issues that this just kind of reveals. And the first is a problem just with social media as a platform, and I'm including YouTube, and I know YouTube isn't necessarily social media in the same way that other things are, but just the internet as a whole. People tend to like to watch things or listen to things or read things that are controversial, or not maybe just controversial, but are oriented toward critique. People like to watch videos that are, a takedown of this or that person. This is something that people are naturally attracted to. We like fights, and we want to see people engaged in fights, and we want to see people who fight for things that we believe in. And again, this is a problem, I think, from a Christian perspective, because we are to focus first and foremost on whatever is true, whatever is good. We are called to focus on those things which are positive and beneficial, rather than to focus primarily on what is wrong and how to critique what is wrong. And so much of social media sphere, so much of what people do online is for the purposes of, yes, monetization and having to make a living for those who do make a living off of these kinds of platforms. You want to grow your platform, you have a financial need to grow your platform, and the way to do that is to engage in controversy. And so I think you can just see this with Cleave to Antiquity, but he's just like many others. You've always got this person's wrong, or this idea is wrong, or you're owning this person, or whatever it might be. And this is just not an ethical way to live. This is not what Christians are called to do. This is not the kind of attitude that we are to have. The second thing is that people make decisions so quickly. And you see this with people converting from this or that theological tradition to another, is that people don't spend nearly the time that they need to studying a tradition before they jump into one thing from another. Now, if you look at someone like Martin Luther, Martin Luther is always the go-to example of somebody who just threw away tradition or threw away authority because he decided that the Bible meant something else, on a whim or something like that. He's portrayed in the worst possible light in these ways. But if you look at Luther's life and his struggle with the doctrine of justification, he spent years studying and praying before he made that what's called the Great Reformation discovery of justification by faith and his understanding of St. Paul. If you take at least one account of Luther's own story, and Luther says all sorts of things in all sorts of places, and it's always kind of hard to exactly put the pieces together, the dates together, in terms of what he was actually wrestling with at what time, or thinking through at what time. But later in life, there's one time where he recounts that during his journey to Rome, and this is when he was sent in the midst of his terrors of conscience and his struggles, Johann von Staupitz, who was his superior in the monastery, he sent Luther to carry this legal brief to Rome with the hopes that Luther going to Rome would kind of resolve some of the struggles he was facing. And this is in 1510. Now, later in life, he tells a story of how when he was in Rome, he had been meditating on that phrase, "the just shall live by faith." Right? St. Paul's citation of the prophet Hosea in Romans chapter 1. Now, if that account is true, if Luther's remembering rightly that he was struggling with that and wrestling with those questions in 1510, Luther didn't come to his Reformation discovery on the doctrine of justification until maybe 1518. It depends on when you date these kinds of things, and there are debates about it. But it was a number of years. And Luther was known to pray for 1 to 2 hours every day. We have some writings and prayers where he's wrestling with these kinds of questions. The point is, these issues are so important that they're ones that you need to prayerfully consider for a significant period of time. These are not things that you should jump into after 2 months. And this is what I see online, is people argue for one thing, and then they find arguments for another thing, and then they jump from this church to that church, and every single time they jump from one church to another, they're just as convinced that they are absolutely right every time. And no matter which church they are involved in at a particular time, they are watching, YouTubers or listening to podcasters that are just as adamant about their correctness as everybody else, and just as nasty toward those who disagree with them. And I've known people, I've seen this, where someone is convinced of one tradition. Say I knew somebody who was a very, very firmly convinced, very strict Reformed Presbyterian, exclusive psalmist, and about as strict Presbyterian as you can be. And then he was convinced of very traditionalist Roman Catholicism, and then he became Eastern Orthodox. And again, he was just as adamant every time that he was right and everybody else was wrong, and probably nobody else is saved in all three of those traditions. And I think that there is a lack of a recognition of the fact that every tradition has its imperfections. And I do think that there is this false understanding or false hope for what one is going to find when they enter into what is the right church, right? The true church. And so this is part of the reason I think people bounce from one thing to another, is that they're looking for a resolution to life's problems and life's difficulties through some kind of theological tradition. But this idea that as soon as they get it right, when they get the right church, it's going to solve all their problems. And the reality is, no matter where they end up, that's just not going to happen, because this is a sinful world, and we are imperfect, sinful people, and every church is sinful and imperfect. And my fear is that the people who bounce back and forth from one thing to another, to another, to another, are eventually, they're so unstable that they are going to depart from the faith altogether. That's my fear. That's my worry, right? I'm not making predictions as this can happen to any particular person, but I have seen this, and I do fear that this instability, being kind of thrown around by every wind of doctrine, as Scripture warns against, is something that is not sustainable in the long run. And then a third thing that I want to say here is we need to be careful about giving people platforms. The way that YouTube works in general is that there are no qualifications for getting onto YouTube. There are no tests that you take. There's no dissertation that you have to write. There is no clergy evaluation committee of one kind or another that you have to go through for them to test you to see if you're qualified to be in the public eye representing Christianity. Anyone can platform themselves. And that means that what is going to make somebody important or notable is really charisma more than anything else. Charisma, and then how well they work the algorithm. And as I said, the algorithm, just by its nature, is going to prioritize controversy. And so if you engage in controversy, you're more likely to be noted. So rather than things like your depth of spiritual formation, or say your depth of character, or your theological acumen and knowledge, your knowledge of Scripture, none of these things are really going to play that significant of a role in you getting a platform online and getting a big voice. In fact, the platform by itself is going to kind of discourage those types of things. And this is a struggle that I have personally, because I know it's the case that I choose to make videos on things that are not going to get me a lot of subscribers. And so this is the constant battle, right? I have this battle within, which is there are constantly issues that come up, and I think, if I made a video about that, I'd get a lot of subscribers. If I made a video about this, if I put this thumbnail, if I did this title, I would get more subs. And I know that's the case, but I try very hard to make decisions based on what is right and just and good, rather than decisions based on the algorithm. And then I pray that faithfulness would be rewarded, that I make enough money with my various things that I do that I could survive. And thus far, God has been gracious to me in that. So, sometimes people wonder or ask me why it is that I'm not maybe on a lot of other channels, and I do interviews, but I'm very careful about it. And I know a lot of the other kind of Christian YouTubers are always on each other's videos, and that really helps to boost the algorithm. And I often choose not to do that. And so I have been asked to be on all sorts of programs and channels that I just don't think are righteous in what they are doing, and not because I disagree with maybe a theological stance that they have, but because I think that the way that those platforms are inherently immoral. I think that they are feeding controversy. They are slanderous and misrepresent, theological opponents. And so when I see channels like that, ones that are way bigger than I am, and they ask me to do things, I say no. And so I have done that on many occasions. I know it hurts me in terms of my subscribers. I know it hurts me financially, but at least I'm trying to do what is right and what is good and just, and I do this with prayer. And I think a lot more people need to try to do that. Now, I don't want to set myself up as like the best example or something, and I'm sure that I have plenty of problems in what I do and choose not to do, but that's at least my desire, and that's what I strive for. So I've been spending some time recently going back to a lot of the sources of Lutheran Orthodoxy, especially Johann Gerhard, to look at what it is that they said about the office of the pastor as well as the office of teacher, which they do generally perceive as a separate office. And it's quite evident when you're looking at sources in the post-Reformation era. This is at least true among the Lutherans. I don't know among the Reformed. You have to ask somebody else about that. But at least among the Lutherans, it is very clear that self-platforming is something that is seen as a negative, and it is something that does not validate you having a genuine call. And you see this especially when the Lutheran reformers are responding to the critiques of Robert Bellarmine that Martin Luther didn't have a right call to do what he did. He was called to be a parish pastor. He was not called to make the kinds of maybe broader claims that he did. And the argument that's made by Gerhard and others as well is that the public call that Luther was given when he became a doctor of theology, when the University of Wittenberg awarded him a doctorate in theology, this then was a call, a public call to teach theology. And so Luther's universal voice in publishing as widely as he did is rooted in something external, is rooted in the fact that he was asked by his ecclesiastical supervisor to pursue a doctorate, and that doctorate was then rewarded. Meaning that the call to do public theology is a call. It is not something that you can just determine yourself. You don't get to just wake up one day and say, boy, I'd like to have a YouTube channel and teach a bunch of people theology and own all the papists. That's not a valid call. It is, I would even say, it is a sinful action on your own part, and you should submit to your pastor, you should submit to your bishop, whatever your ecclesiastical structure is. You need to have an ecclesiastical structure, and you can't appoint yourself as anything. And I see this problem repeatedly. And I see it on behalf of some Roman Catholic apologists as well. So this isn't just a Protestant issue. In fact, it's usually the nastiest Roman Catholic apologists that are the ones that have no right or proper call either, that are really acting much more like Anabaptists than they are like anything else, because they're acting without any external call or validation for what they're doing whatsoever. So self-platforming is just a problem in general. And so, again, that is one of the reasons why I haven't gone on a lot of people's YouTube channels, because I, again, wrestle with this. Someone asked me to go on their channel, and I'm like, okay, well, I know they're a lot bigger than I am. I could go on there, and I could do an interview, and it would expose me to more people. But then I'm validating what they're doing, and I don't think that what they're doing is right. I don't think that it is proper and right order, so I then choose not to do it. So anyway, I know that my opinions on this are controversial. I know that my opinions on this aren't shared by basically anybody else, but that's okay. So it is what it is, and I still think I'm right. But I'd love to hear your thoughts, even critiques, that's fine if you want to leave those in the comments below. And please do subscribe so I can continue to bring educational theological content to you. Thanks so much. We'll see you in the next one. God bless.